Um, I'd like to thank Source for. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Source for inviting me out here to the East Coast and for giving me a venue to offer this presentation. My name is Bill. I'm from below Gotham, and today I'm here to talk about rootkit technology and where I think things are going to be headed, maybe over the long run. I'm going to start with a story. There was a story that popped up in the media a couple of years ago. I think it was 2008. There's a story about a Japanese bachelor who lived alone in a western city in Japan, and over this series of several months, he noticed that food had gone missing from his kitchen, and he's like, "What's going on? Maybe is someone coming to my house and stealing my food?" So he put up a security camera and had it stream photos to his mobile phone. And one day he gets a picture. There's someone in his house walking around, and he's like, "Oh my God!" He calls the cops, and they rush over thinking we can catch this burglar, and catch him in the act. So the cops rush in, sirens blaring and everything, and they notice that the doors are locked, the windows are all closed. They're like, what the heck? So they search around the house and they open a closet, and they find this woman curled up in a little ball at the bottom of the closet, and they question her. And so according to the woman, she's been living there for a little over a year, and she's homeless, didn't have a place to live. And the guy left his door unlocked one day, and she found her way in. And the police spokesman, who the press people talked to, said that she was notably neat and clean. She took showers, she did all sorts of stuff, and she moved a mattress in on the bottom of the closet, and he just never knew she was there. And in a sense, that's what a rootkit is. It's an intruder that's notably neat and clean, and maybe even difficult to get rid of. In terms of implementing a rootkit, one way to stay neat and clean is to stay memory resident. That way, if the investigator powers down the machine and does a post-mortem analysis, they won't find anything, maybe anything outside of the paging file. If they're lucky, they'll find something in the paging file. They might not know what it is, and so, anyways. But even if you decide to stay memory resident, there's two challenges that you're going to face, and these kind of define our design requirements. I mean, if you were going to build a rootkit, and want to make it memory resident, there are two issues. The first one is avoiding someone doing memory analysis at runtime. Some investigator doing an incident response a live incident response is going to maybe do a perfunctory analysis of memory. That doesn't happen a lot. Even the people who sell the software that does forensic analysis will admit that it's still kind of an emerging area that people are working on. And you also have to worry about surviving reboot. Obviously, if you're memory resident, the machine goes off, you're toast. So we can recast these two items as requirements, as design goals for a rootkit that's memory resident. And so let's look at the first one, avoiding memory analysis or concealment, basically. The old school approach is to hide in a crowd. So you either you create a new process and you rename it so that it looks inconspicuous and camouflages in with existing processes. There's a whole bunch, and if you're a harried system administrator, you don't have a lot of time. Sometimes it's very easy to look over the task list and just skip something entirely. Or you can maybe inject a DLL or a thread into an existing process. That's another way to kind of hide in a crowd. Now, the catch is that this approach, it's kind of an age-old approach. It works maybe in the short term, but it won't survive the standard forensic incident response process. In fact, if you read books like Harlan Carvey's or Richard Balick's, this methodology that exists today is meant to capture stuff like this, and it will. If you do a rigorous process, you'll find it eventually. When I started at San Francisco State University as an IT guy, I walked into this college and it was a war zone. There wasn't even a firewall around anything. We had all of our faculty, staff, machines internet addressable IP addresses. Some of them not even had didn't even have like the Windows firewall activated, and it was just like, there were bullets flying everywhere, and they got all of our servers. They compromised our domain controllers. And one thing they did, which, looking after the fact, is kind of interesting. They took our web server and they activated the Windows Update services, the SUS servers, right? And they set it up so that it started. They changed the group policy for the domains so that all of our client machines pointed to this SUS server for its updates, for their updates, and it streamed out this package, this MSI package. It was a cracked version of Dameware, and so which is basically a remote desktop, application, which has legitimate purposes. In this case, it wasn't legitimate. So all of our machines had Dameware on it, and so you look through the process. First thing I usually do is look through the process. If you looked through originally, there was this process in the task list called rpcnet.exe, and you might skip it initially thinking, okay, it's an RPC service or something like that, but it wasn't. It ended up being something else. And so just, if you do the standard response, the standard live response, you'll catch this stuff. So they responded, the hackers responded and saying, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll rely on system modification to hide stuff after the fact. We'll install stuff, and then we'll modify the underlying operating system so that it hides what we install. And there's a bunch of ways to do that. There's hooking, detour patching, and other stuff. You want to manipulate dynamic stuff, decom, and callback tables that you can kind of subvert. And so the problem with this approach is you're hiding stuff after you have actually launched the module. So there's a certain degree of bookkeeping data structures that are updated in the operating system. So you've launched this module, and then you've altered the system to hide stuff. But you can only hide so much before it's not execute anymore. If you want the code to execute, it still has to be registered to some extent with the operating system. And this is kind of what a lot of security software relies on. It's like, okay, we'll do a cross-view detection where we'll look at the system from a high point, at the API level, and then maybe we'll parse data structures directly and do a low-level analysis and then compare the two. And sure enough, if a lot of these tools will catch stuff because you can only hide so much before the kernel's not scheduling your code to execute anymore. Some of the vendors who sell security software have actually wised up to the fact that APIs and stuff and libraries can be subverted at runtime by a rootkit. So they said, okay, we're gonna sidestep the APIs altogether. What we're gonna do is we're gonna parse stuff in memory directly. We're gonna start off, and then we're just gonna manually go through everything without relying on the API to do it for us. And that's not a bad approach. What that resulted in was, okay, the Black Hat said, okay, we're going to take this one step further. We're going to move to a mode of execution where we're outside what would normally be considered the operating system proper, and we're going to jump into these kind of out-of-bounds regions and rely on those. The typical, what I have here is like the rogue hypervisor, the SMM mode rootkit, and the AMT environment, which are basically what you would consider ring -1, ring -2, and ring -3 rootkits. The Intel processor supports 4 rings of execution of protective, privilege levels in the processor. Windows only uses 2 of those. Primarily, it has to do with historical kind of portability reasons. When NT first came out, they wanted it to run on MIPS. They wanted to run on DEC Alpha. They wanted to run a whole bunch of stuff. And Intel was just another chipset. So they didn't want to, anchor themselves to the foibles of one processor. So they didn't use all 4 rings that the Intel processor offers. And so there's only, for historical reasons, you really have a 2-ring model. You have the user mode and the kernel mode. And with these extra features that get added on, you have actually rings within that. You have the ring 0, which is kernel mode, and then the ring -1, which is what hypervisors will execute in. SMM mode, which is used for like some hardware related stuff like power management software. You can consider that ring -2. And then if you look at the slides for Black Hat USA from 2009, the Invisible Things Lab had something on the AMT environment, which was interesting. And I guess you could consider that a ring -3 rootkit. So this is kind of a trend, and that is that the vendors try to create these fortified regions of execution where they say, okay, we want to protect ourselves a little bit better by going outside of this 2-ring model and getting that to a higher or lower ring, I guess you'd say that. Getting to a lower ring where we'll be a little more protected from malware. So it's not a bad idea, but what happens when the malware finds its way into those lower rings and subverts that? So the downside of going into these, like, the rogue hypervisor or SMM mode or the AMT environment is that it's really hardware dependent. And as an attacker, if you don't have physical access and you don't have anyone on the inside, you can ping for information about the information you're trying to get at, and you don't necessarily know what type of hardware you're really targeting. You might start off doing a network-based attack. You follow that whole like hacking exposed methodology where you footprint and then you do a host enumeration, and then you start scanning for services, yada, yada, yada. And what you finally end up with is maybe a network scan of all the services running on a machine. So all you start off with is that list of services. You don't know necessarily what hardware you're running on. And so you can't kind of prepare in advance to have a rootkit which is going to target this firmware on this motherboard, and you don't have any of that information. So that's kind of the downside of these bleeding edge stuff. It's impressive work, no doubt about it, but it's not always realistic to assume that's going to be there for you to leverage. So we have to make concessions, right? We want to hide, and we want to be able to conceal our rootkit and anything else we might be doing. At the same time, we want to remain hardware agnostic as much as possible. Obviously, my talk, I'm targeting Intel. So when I say that hardware agnostic, I mean, a specific, external peripheral chipset or something, maybe a video card or something, or a BIOS chipset. So I wanted to kind of avoid having to anchor my code to that kind of hardware. So we have to reach a middle path, as they say in Zen. We have to find a compromise. And so one potential middle path is shellcode. You heard me. So shellcode offers a little bit of autonomy because it doesn't rely on the system loader. It doesn't need address resolution. You just basically plop it into memory, and you don't have to do anything else. And because of that, all those bookkeeping data structures you would normally be updating when you load a module, whether it's a driver or a DLL or an executable or whatever, none of that happens. And so you have there's less. You're leaving less of a footprint on the system. At the same time, you have some portability because you're just basically using the core Intel instruction set. You're not necessarily relying on a specific BIOS chip. So we have this middle ground, right? Now, obviously, anyone who's worked with shellcode knows that it can be complicated to, after a certain point, the whole reason of higher level languages was the complexity of dealing with low level machine instructions. Even in assembly, it's a pain in the butt. After anything more than 1,000 lines of code, it just becomes, there are conventions you can adopt to kind of ease the pain, but it can still be unpleasant. So you'd think that there'd be some way around this. Maybe we could write shellcode in C. Wouldn't that be nice? And just, and so we could deal with it in a high level language. And there's actually been work that's been done on that. Back at the Black Hat Europe 2009, there was a pretty cool thing that this guy built. It's like it's a shell code, and it will build shell code for you. So there are different types of shellcode. Obviously, I said the Intel has the 2-ring model. You have a user mode and kernel mode, and you can write shellcode for either or. I prefer kernel mode shellcode because the kernel's a little more opaque. There's a little more entropy, I think, in the kernel. Also, by executing in the kernel, you're on equal footing with security software for the most part. Most security software, if it does, there haven't been that many products that will go into hypervisor mode and be a watchdog. Most of the stuff will just maybe have a kernel mode driver presence that they'll stick in the kernel. And so if you just stuck and you just plopped your stuff in user mode, there really wouldn't be much of a way for you to fight back or preempt. But in kernel mode, it's toe to toe, and I think you have a bit of an advantage over security software in that sense. So I liked it because it basically offers me a little better concealment and some more powerful features. So we looked at concealment, and we ended up having to make a compromise and going with shellcode. And so now let's tackle the other design goal, which is surviving reboot. Some people would say, why do you even have to worry about surviving a reboot? I mean, the enterprise systems like IBM Z Series, their flagship mainframe product, which is really the bread and butter of IBM's enterprise, tradition. No one ever got fired for going with IBM, and this is what distinguishes them. Basically, I think they have these mainframes that are built, and all around it's all about being up and available and stable. And so it's like, well, these systems don't go down. Why do you even have to worry about a system restart? Well, as it turns out, this isn't always the case. There are high-end deployments where they actually do reboot their machines, like the Chicago Stock Exchange. The exchanges are open for so many hours every day, and after the markets close, they have the luxury of rebooting all their machines. Or there'll be other installations where what they'll do is they'll institute rolling restarts, so that they don't turn all the machines off, they turn a subset off, and then it just rolls through the deployment. So one way so there actually is an issue. You do kind of have to worry about a system reboot. You can't always depend upon the server being up. So why not plan for the worst and have a contingency in place? And one way to kind of get ideas is to look at the commercial vendors and the solutions that they've used to implement self-healing software or fault-tolerant software. There's a company called Absolute, which sells a product called Computrace to that, and it's an inventory tracking. Officially speaking, they say it's inventory tracking. So if you lose your laptop, it will help you get it back. And so this product consists of two different components. There's an application agent, which is that RPC net.exe. And it runs as a service. And like I said, it kind of blends in with the other services. And what it does, at least the version that we use at San Francisco State, what it does is you can, if you're watching it through Procmon, the sysinternals tool, you can see that it will launch a web browser, and that web browser will do a post over HTTPS to the mothership, and that post will be sending information, ostensibly inventory and software management information to Absolute every so often. And then there's the other part of it, which is a persistence module. The persistence module is actually the stealthy component. They usually install it on the disk partition gap. And there's a bunch of laptop models and stuff nowadays that actually have firmware level support, which is really kind of a really work intensive process, because they have connections with OEMs. So they actually can get access to the specifications they need to do this. As a black hat, you're not going to have any vendor cooperation on anything. So it's a little more problematic in terms of embedding stuff in the BIOS. It's a lot more work. Back at the Black Hat 2009 USA, and when the Invisible Things Lab did the AMT environment, I think I overheard Joanna Rutkowska say that the work that they did on that represented like 6 months of reversing effort. And so I'm thinking, Absolute doesn't have to worry about that, because they go to the vendor, they get the spec, they get any information they need, they don't have to do any reversing. And so all that energy that they would have spent on reversing can be devoted strictly to development. And so that's, in a sense, that's kind of a distinguishing feature, I think, between commercial software and, independent attack software, is you have to actually do the reversing and pull your hair out and whatnot. So, like I said, the application agent, it runs as a nondescript service. So there's kind of mild level of concealment, but not that much. And you could take this idea that you have this application agent and a persistence module, and it wouldn't take too much to kind of abstract this into a rootkit, right? If you look at the application agent, runs as a nondescript service, okay, concealment. Phones home and manages helper apps, command and control. Collects inventory data, well, collecting data, surveillance, all right? So you making that switch from one intent to another, it's not that far of a jump. So there are a number of ways you could implement the backup rootkit. So the idea is here, you implement fault tolerance, so you can survive reboot by instituting a secondary rootkit, a backup rootkit. And there are different ways you could do that. You could just basically install another service, which checks to see that the primary service is up and running. But from a forensic standpoint, that's pretty conspicuous. And if someone does a post-mortem, they're going to see that. They're going to scan the registry, and they're going to see that entry right away. It's going to stick out like a sore thumb. A bootkit like Stoned Again, or God, what's that? The NV Labs also has a bootkit called, I think, vBootkit. And these are a little less conspicuous. But again, if they're doing a post-mortem and they have maybe an initial disk image, or they know what they're looking for, they're going to see that the bootkit's there. They're going to recognize it. So again, it's less conspicuous, but it's still vulnerable. So the ultimate is to do a firmware-based module, and I've talked about that. And it's like the vendors like Absolute, who do like legitimate inventory tracking software, they don't have a problem with this. But for someone who's a part of an independent lab, or maybe you're an honest to God professional black hat on your own, it's a lot more work. So again, concessions. We want to survive system restart, and we want to minimize the amount of forensic evidence. But we don't want to have to sit here and go through that painful reversing process to survive in the firmware. So in other words, we want a stealthy, fault-tolerant, but logistically tenable solution, right? So here's one solution. Okay, rather than put your backup rootkit on the same machine, put it on another machine. Stick it somewhere else. Have the primary rootkit emit a heartbeat periodically. The backup rootkit will listen for it. And if it stops hearing the heartbeat, it will assume, okay, either the machine's restarted, or maybe it crashed or whatever, but I bet you the primary rootkit's not there anymore, so it reinstalls. And this leads me to an aside. One thing I've noticed is that the desktop machines of high-ranking executive officers are pretty soft targets. Just based on my own experience, these people often have admin rights on their own machine, ostensibly so they can get their jobs done, right? It's like, I have work to do. If I want to install this application, I need to be able to do it. I don't want to sit here and make a help desk ticket or anything for you to come install my stuff, so just give me the rights. And because they're high ranking, even IT directors are kind of at a loss for saying, no, you can't do that. We won't give you admin rights. And it's like, I'm your boss. I write your check. Give me admin rights. So they often end up with administrative rights, and they're not always technically savvy. Some of them are, but a lot of times they aren't. And some of these same executives have a habit of installing all sorts of crapware on their machines. They'll install, whatever they find that looks bright and shiny, and they'll install it. Ooh, a new widget for my desktop. Cool. So these machines are noisy. There's a lot of network activity often. The task list is extensive. And a lot of this is coming down to the fact that for the typical system administrator, it's all about availability. Admins will scream availability, and the assurance and security people will scream security. But for an admin, it's all about ultimately catering to business needs. And this is what makes, I think, the desktop machine is going to be one of the new targets. A lot of times the servers can be carefully guarded. But the data's not just stuck on the server, right? It goes all over the place. It ends up on client machines, If some guy's doing a query, or he's typing in his password, which will access the data on the database. And so There was a blog article by Richard Bailick called "Protect the Data," where he talks about this. It's not, you can't just isolate the data and just put your eggs in one basket and watch the basket, because the eggs are going all over the place. You've got to protect all sorts of stuff. And so I think that this desktop as a target is actually, that's where things are headed. And these high-level execs who get admin rights, boy, those desktops are juicy targets. So we wanted concealment, we ended up with shellcode, and we wanted to survive system restart. So we ended up relying on a secondary rootkit. Question? Okay. So let's move on to implementation. How did I actually create the shellcode, the kernel mode shellcode? First thing I had to do was to get the stream of bytes all in one place. I wanted my shellcode. You don't want it to be spanning multiple segments. That will be a nightmare. Just for issues like offset displacements and stuff like that, and address resolution. You want your shellcode to be stuck in one little code segment you can rip out, and then convert into an array or whatever you're going to want to do with it. And I used Visual Studio to do this. There's probably plenty of ways to write shellcode. I promise you, plenty of custom solutions you can use. I decided it would be an interesting challenge if I could take the opposition's tools and subvert them against them. And so I used Visual Studio. I said, hey, how could I write shellcode with Visual Studio? Well, this is how you do it. I use these pragmas to get all of my code into one little section with a custom name, code.code, which is arbitrary. And like I said, shellcode does its own address resolution. So I had my own, basically my own little internal symbol table within this code section. And this symbol table, in terms of the C code, was represented as a C data structure, GD as in global data. Right? And so where did storage actually exist? Well, I had a placeholder routine. And this placeholder routine basically did nothing more than take up space in memory, right? And because I need that space in memory to hold all the addresses that I basically want to import. So at runtime, I cast it, cast the storage space to the structure. But I'm basically imposing the composition of the structure onto this memory, onto the storage space, which is represented by the function. Such that if I want to access an address at runtime, basically all I need is the address of the structure, and then an offset, which the compiler figures out, and that makes it a lot easier. So all I really need is the address of this global data routine, which is just a placeholder. And the end result is I can take a whole bunch of addresses and really work with them all in terms of just this one address. And so how did I do my own address resolution? And that's like one of the quandaries of shellcode. Is there, how do you face the challenge of finding the addresses of routines that you want to access? Well, I ended up using a technique called the MSR scan down. There's a system registry, a system register, the MSR register, which is guaranteed to have an address which resides in the kernel's the PE image. The kernel itself is really just a Windows PE file, so it adheres to the standard format of the Windows PE file. So this MSR register will have an address that's guaranteed to be in that PE image of the kernel, and which is called scan down because you get that address and then you go down until you find the signature which marks the beginning of the image. And all those files, they have this magic set of values in the beginning, which mark it as a PE file. Once you find those, then you scan back up until you hit the import address table. Then now you've got all the addresses that are in the kernel's image. And you can rip those out, not rip them out, but copy them out as you need to and put them in your own internal symbol table. And in this sense, you avoid having to use the loader. And like I said, the advantage of that is none of the bookkeeping data structures get created or get updated. So another thing I had to work with or deal with is the fact that the Visual Studio compiler tries to be friendly. It tries to help you. It tries to add stuff like buffer overflow checking and type checks and random optimization and stuff like that. And it adds a lot of stuff in your code that you don't want there, you don't need there. And in fact, if you try to write shellcode and there's this stuff in there, it will break it. It won't work. What I had to do was figure out how to get rid of all this. And so I didn't want the compiler to be helpful. I wanted basically just give me what I'm asking for. Just convert basically my C code into machine code. Don't add anything extra into it. So this is all trial and error. None of this is documented anywhere. So I spent a fun afternoon, I'd compile, I would look at the listing, I'd look at the machine code that got generated. I tried to run it, it would blue screen, repeat, rinse, wash, repeat several times until I finally got it right. And another thing I wanted it to do was to make sure that the machine code that I generated was in the same order as the functions that existed in the source code file. So as you read the source code from beginning to end, the source code, the machine code gets generated in the same order as the functions in the source listing. And you can actually see that I was successfully able to do that by looking at this header file in my source code. What I did was I took the shellcode out and converted it into a C array so that I could play with it later on. So this code section in the file you create, in this executable you create, that's really what you're after. All that extra stuff that gets created, you don't need. All you want is that shellcode. So how do you find out where it is in the file? There's a tool called dumpbin, which is pretty standard, which will tell you, for each section, where that section is located as a raw physical offset in the file. And so that's how I did it. And then I went old school. I probably could have written a tool to do this, but I was in a hurry. I was too busy doing what I was doing, and I didn't want to take the time to stop. So I just used a hex editor and ripped the code out from, it started at offset 400. As you can see, there's some nulls that are padded in there, and I have a feeling it has something to do with alignment of sections or something to that effect. And because this code's position independent, you can pretty much ignore the leading nulls. That's what I did. So I ripped this code out with a hex editor. So when you're dealing with shellcode, especially in the kernel, one mistake can ruin your day. You will get a stop error, you will blue screen, and you'll sit quietly and watch your machine restart. Or if you're using a virtual machine, maybe you can save yourself a little bit of pain. It'll be a little quicker cycle back from blue screen. So one thing I did to kind of ease the pain of this process was I started off, normally you'd load the shellcode in somewhere and you'd modify the system to intercept the path of execution so it could execute your code. But I didn't want to modify, I wanted to keep the modification of the system as small as possible. So I stuck this shellcode within a routine in a kernel mode driver that I'd loaded. Right, and so that kind of allowed me to safely manipulate stuff without having to modify, anything else. I just load my shellcode within the confines of my own kind of laboratory, which is this kernel mode driver. And this placeholder routine is nothing more than just a bunch of nulls, a bunch of no ops, right? And then so I load the shellcode into this placeholder routine, and then launch it as a system thread. And then that's to kind of test things out before actually making the jump and actually, modifying the system and loading the shellcode in that way. But again, this is a little too conspicuous. You don't want to load a driver just to get just for the sake of, if your shellcode and the driver's, running at the same time, it's just a giveaway. So it's more like a training wheels kind of approach. So one way you could launch this code, if you wanted to launch a shellcode, was you could have a staging driver, which exists strictly to allocate memory somewhere in the kernel, maybe through the non-page pool or something like that. And then you could have an exploited user mode process, which through device I/O control takes the shellcode and loads it down into the space that you've allocated. Once you've done that, then the rest of it's just scaffolding. It can self-destruct and poof, vanish. Hopefully removing traces of itself that, of the staging driver and everything else you don't need anymore. So you have the shellcode that's loaded, right, that you've loaded. And, in and of itself, it's pretty benign. It's just a bunch of bytes in memory. It's not scheduled for execution by the kernel because you didn't use the loader. You didn't register it through legitimate channels. It's just a bunch of bytes in memory. And it has no formal interface to the I/O manager, again, because it's not a driver, it's not anything else, it's just bytes in memory. So it's kind of swimming alone, with no connection to the rest of the system. Poor lonely shellcode. So how do we get it to execute? Well, we need to intercept an existing path of execution. And this kind of brings to light a misconception that I started off with when I started working with system software. I was under the notion that the kernel mode and user mode kind of ran independently of each other. In other words, it's like two software engineers who are in cubes next to each other. They kind of sit there and spin and doing their own thing. And every so often a joke or something will pass over the side of the cubes between the two guys. And so that's how I kind of saw how things, but it's probably more realistic to say that the execution context of a system is a bunch of paths, and they flow pretty naturally from user mode to kernel mode. And all you've got to do to get your shellcode to execute is to intercept one of those paths. And so there are ways you can do that. You can modify, the system. You can call table hooking as one way to kind of intercept an execution path. There's detour patching. You can go for kind of a dynamic approach and manipulate callbacks. If you want to kind of do the walk before you can run approach, and I actually done this, and you start off by manipulating the system using table hooking. And when you feel comfortable with that, you move on and you switch it over to a detour patch. And once you feel like you can do that comfortably, then you move on to patching dynamic stuff, which makes it harder for people to detect that you're there and you're moving around. Okay, so we looked at implementing shellcode. How about implementing the heartbeat, which is what the primary rootkit will emit, and this backup rootkit will detect. There are different ways to do a heartbeat. You could use the existing TCP/IP stack, which means you just be using standard APIs to create network traffic. And there's a couple different APIs at the kernel level. None of them are painless, but it's still easier than rolling your own stack or talking directly to the network card. You could, if you wanted to, roll your own TCP/IP stack, which would be a lot more work and be less conspicuous, because the connection that you create then with that new stack isn't registered by the old stack, and basically all the system mechanisms that are there that use that stack. So if you were sitting in front of the console, you wouldn't see the connection, because all the existing equipment in the operating system is assuming that you're using the current legitimate stack, and you're not. And it also allows you to bypass filtering mechanisms, which are also built upon the existing TCP/IP stack. So you build your own, you can bypass all that. If you really want to go full geek, you could probably talk directly to the hardware. But that's a full-time job in and of itself. So there are probably people that's their job, is doing that kind of code. So like I said, the latter two offer better concealment from the standpoint of someone sitting at the console. If you're running TCP view or a netstat, you won't see any of this. If you've rolled your own stack or you're talking directly to the hardware, you won't see any of that if you're using these tools. And you won't have to worry about any firewall rules, because you're not using the stack which is subject to those rules. But there are problems with this approach. And it comes down to like Harlan Carvey's observation that the absence of an artifact is itself often an artifact. For example, if you have an enlightened or maybe paranoid forensic person who's decided, I'm going to start capturing all the network data that's coming off of this compromised machine. And so they're doing a full content data capture. They might see this traffic, and they're going to go back to the machine, and they're going to look, and they're not going to see it. So they're going to say, my God, I don't see this connection, this HTTPS connection, or I don't see this ICMP traffic, or whatever. This isn't showing up from the console, but yet I'm seeing it over the network. So this discrepancy exists, and in a sense, it serves as a hallmark, that something's wrong. That will raise the flag. The whole idea of a rootkit is to make the person at the machine, or who's doing the investigation think, there's nothing wrong with this machine. There's nothing here. Go back. Go away. There's nothing here. And if they see something like this, the jig is up, because now something's wrong. There's an aberration. So we have to make concessions. We want to be stealthy, but at the same point, we don't want to be so stealthy that we become conspicuous. So the solution I decided to go with was protocol tunneling, right? Basically, it's hide in a crowd. You find, and this is kind of context dependent. It depends upon what kind of environment you're in and what traffic is going on between the machines. You kind of have to be flexible. And in that sense, maybe your rootkit would have to separate mechanism from policy. Maybe you'd be able to cater to several different, scenarios, and your code would just have to be able to detect which one is appropriate and use that. And as you can see, people have jokingly told me this is a 1990s approach to doing stuff. There's a FRAC article on ICMP tunneling that came out in the 1990s. So there are countermeasures. So we looked at concealment. We went with shellcode. We wanted to be able to survive reboots. So we went with a secondary backup rootkit and the heartbeat generated through protocol tunneling. What kind of countermeasures do the white hats have that they can use? So Jesse Kornblum pointed out the rootkit paradox. A rootkit wants to execute, but at the same time, it wants to remain hidden. And that's a problem because, like I said, you can only hide so much before you're not running anymore. So if the operating system can find the rootkit, the code to execute it, then the investigator can find it too. And I would add that a rootkit just doesn't want to execute, it also wants to communicate with the outside. And that's kind of another kind of linchpin. Most rootkits will establish some sort of covert channel with a remote party. Now, again, and because of this, it will be possible ultimately to see something going on. But just because it's possible doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It's possible to make a lot of money in the stock market. All you got to do is buy low and sell high. But that doesn't mean it's easy in practice. So, like I said, modifying the system is a common way of hiding. You launch your module, then you modify the system to hide whatever you've launched and everything else. And so, most security software will try to detect local modification. This product HookSafe that came out a little while back. It's basically a watchdog hypervisor, and it monitors guest operating systems for these little modifications that happen as a result of your rootkit wanting to hide. But not all hooks are the same. Some hooks are static and can be easily detected, but some aren't as easy. Some are based on dynamic objects, which it's much harder to say, whether something's been subverted or not, or whether this address is legitimate or it isn't. So this is why I prefer callbacks. They're generated dynamically. They're all over the place, and it's not always obvious what's legitimate and what isn't. And then there's also the fact that you could also subvert the components that they're testing for modification. There was Windows has got a feature called kernel patch protection, KPP, and there was an arms race for a while. There was an online magazine called Uninformed that had a series of articles about subverting patch protection, and they went back and forth. And Microsoft would realize what was going on, and they tried to modify their code, and it was interesting. So you can also another tack to take is vision in the police department. And I think ultimately, in terms of where things are going, I think network security monitoring is going to be a big deal because it's a lot. You can hide stuff on a local machine. You can interfere with the process of data collection on a machine as a rootkit, but it's a lot harder on the network because it's more passive. If you're doing a full content data capture and maybe you're on a span port or something, you capture everything, and it's a lot harder to kind of implement some sort of subversion and make it harder for the investigator because they see everything. But then when it comes down to it, I think foiling the forensic investigator, it's all about buying time, because ultimately they have a budget, and a lot of times they're constrained by kind of the organizational shortcomings of a bureaucracy, and having a limited budget. And so if you read this blog by Balick, he basically says as much, that they have limited resources, and you can kind of take advantage of this. And you just have to buy time. You have to make it difficult enough that they don't have the resources to really go down and find you. So my kind of solutions here, my middle paths, obviously there's some shortcomings to them, and there's room for improvement. The heartbeat that I do injects new packets into the network stream, and that is problematic because there's new stuff that pops up, and an experienced eye will catch this. So one answer to this is don't inject new packets, don't create new network traffic. Embed yourself in embed your data that you're exfiltrating or your command that you're issuing and the response you're getting, embed that in the packets that are already going back and forth across the network. You embed your stuff steganographically inside the existing traffic. And that's kind of the idea behind a passive covert channel. And there's been a lot of work done on that, which is pretty cool, pretty bleeding edge. Obviously, the problem with it is that you kind of throttles the amount of information. If you're twiddling ISN numbers on packets, there's kind of gives you an upper bound in terms of the rate at which you can move data in and out. So for a password, for the password hashes, if you were filtering those out, that'd be pretty easy. But for a large database table, it'd be a little more problematic. So for command and control, one way to generalize the idea of a rootkit and to kind of make it into a framework would be to use a kernel mode virtual machine. That way you could abstract your logic into a platform neutral bytecode and then implement the rest of it in kernel mode shellcode. And that would give you some degree of portability. And even more important, bytecode, the virtual machine bytecode tends to lend itself towards dynamic loading. And in terms of a rootkit, this means runtime extensions, where there's going to be a packet sniffer or a keylogger or some sort of instance-specific attack where you're going to go after some specific security software package. And that kind of is a way for you to add features and give your rootkit some flexibility. And finally, runtime deployment, the initial scenario that I introduced was basically using an exploited user mode process and then funneling the kernel mode shellcode down through device I/O control. And that's kind of a somewhat awkward, and extended approach. A more direct approach would be just to leverage a buggy kernel mode driver that's already on the system that has something you can exploit. And that's probably the best way to load the shellcode in kernel mode is just to find a buggy driver and to load, basically exploit that, some sort of buffer overflow or something, and load your code that way. And if you want to download the source code to this kind of proof of concept stuff that I've done, you can go to my website at Below Gotham, and I've also written a book that details other stuff that I can't fit into an hour. And that's also, you can go on Amazon or go to my website. There's some information on it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Just a comment, I found it interesting. You're saying you're going to turn off all these features of the compiler to make your shellcode. Does it make you uncomfortable that you might be writing vulnerable exploits?
Yeah, well, absolutely. What did Stan Lee say, or was it Spider-Man? He said, "With great power comes great responsibility." Right? I can see exactly what you're saying. So it's the cost of admittance. You just have to be careful. That's a good point, though. Thank you. Anyone else? Ooh.
Yeah, this is kind of an uninformed question, but you did a great job, I thought, of outlining the approach that you would take, writing the perfect rootkit, and then the various mitigations people might apply to find it. And those sounded awfully labor-intensive to me.
Oh my God, yes. And that's one of the reasons that it's all about buying time with anti-forensics, because it's a labor-intensive process. As a system administrator, I find a machine that's compromised. My first response, as a system administrator, with other people breathing down my neck, wanting help, is to crash and burn, the scorched earth policy, you flatten and re-image. That's my first response. I would love to say, okay, ooh, there's malware on here. Let's take it off. Let's analyze it. Let's take a whole week. We can reverse it and we can see what it's doing, do a behavioral analysis, get a sandbox, do other stuff. Oh my God, it'd be so much fun. Unfortunately, I don't have time. So assessment and assessment in general is a lengthy process, and forensic investigation can take days or weeks, depending on how far you want to take it, how much budget you have, how critical is the situation you're in. Is it if you're working for a government and it's a classified machine that has classified data, you might be willing to go the extra yards. But if you're just some IT guy like me and you've got other people with other needs, you might just throw your arms up and say rebuild, reimage.
It's enough to know that you were compromised.
Yeah. So it's definitely it's all about time budget. It's because forensic analysis is so, and there have been attempts to automate. I mean, investigators realize this, and they rely on their tools to automate, right? To kind of help them. And there's a whole market for stuff like that. Like for doing postmortem, and case is the standard tool, right? From guidance. If you want to do memory analysis, I know Mandy has stuff, and HB Gary has the responder, and there's all sorts of packages to help ease the burden and to decrease the amount of time it's going to take you. But even then, you can still do stuff to cause them, to make it time intensive. So software to an extent will help with automation, but as an investigator, you're not your tools. It's all about methodology. You can get from A to B however you want to get to A to B. But getting to A to B is always going to be expensive in terms of time. So I think that it is. It's always going to be a labor-intensive process. It's just a sad, and that's why, because computers it's all about complexity. There's so much there. There's so much data that gets generated, right? The average machine, if you have full logging turned on and all this other monitoring, so it can churn out gigabytes of information, So it's just this is why defense is hard, right? Because you have all this stuff to watch, and you have a limited budget, and it's just it's a fact of life. The black hats have the advantage, and this is why they tend to win. Yep.
Being a white hat presenting a case, what have you found as balance of the other white hats presenting at similar conferences, balancing ethics versus what you presented?
Okay. I can tell you now that what I'm presenting here, it's not black hat, it's not white hat, it's old hat. All right. This stuff has been the bleeding, the cutting edge, the stuff that the intelligence agencies are using, the real hardcore stuff is years ahead of what I just presented. A lot of it's, like I said, probably hardware based, and that's because they can get cooperation from the vendors, and that stuff is really difficult. I mean, I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that attack. I probably wouldn't find it. It'd probably just stay there, So in terms of like ethical considerations, I don't really see myself as giving anything away that the black hats don't already know, right? I think that for them, they're like, that we did that 10 years ago. We don't do that anymore. We have much better approaches. So I think what I'm doing is kind of a service to the white hat, saying, this is what you need to be aware of. This is how bad it is. This is what can happen. And if you want to know where things are today in terms of, honest to God, offensive weaponry that's used like military grade against other countries, you notice you never hear about a rootkit that's written by the United States ever being caught anywhere, right? You hear about other attacks being detected everywhere else, but you never hear about an attack that we perform unless we admit we did it, right? So I think that if you want to find out where things are going, you could extrapolate from this material a few years out, and that's where things would be. So in a sense, I'm merely kind of saying these are things you should be aware of. This is how bad it is, or how dangerous it can be, and these are things you should be aware of. So I don't think I'm necessarily giving away bad stuff to bad people. It's more like I'm kind of offering a warning and kind of increasing awareness for the white hats.
Maybe the equivalent of talking about wartime atrocities in World War II.
Yes.
It gives you a good historical perspective. and gee, that's bad stuff, but.
Yeah. Like I said, I think that, like, if you look at Absolute's product, like I said, they have the cooperation of the OEMs. They can get the specs for the chipsets, and they'll get it right away. And so there's no reversing. They get what they need, and they can start developing. You know, the development process starts, and so they can have some reliable, you know, heavy feature heavy products. For the people in intelligence, it's probably even more so. They probably even have more cooperation. They might even, there was a story in the New York Times that came out, I think about a year ago, where they were worried about chips being manufactured abroad, that intelligence agencies, this is a New York Times article, I can't remember it's on my website for sure, if you search the news at my website, they were worried that these chipsets coming from other countries had circuit level subversion and they're pretty sure it's the intelligence agencies in the other countries initiated this to put these little things in so that when they come back to us and we use them in our systems, now we're vulnerable. And there's nothing you can do to defend against it. You can install all the antivirus you want to, forget about it. You know. Yep.
Just to speak to that point, I know I can't remember which government agency it was, but I think one of the national masters, they work on machine out because they manufacture their own chipset.
Yep.
They have their own chip that lab.
The NSA used to do hardware. They used to be the sole producer of, I think, some hardware-based encryption products. And I think that only recently there have been other producers, but that's the level. That's what I'm talking about. People are paranoid. It's like these chips. You know, a lot of times, you know, our chips are produced somewhere else, and so if you really do want good security, you'll build your own chips. That's completely reasonable. You know, and so that's how far it's gone. I think it's gone all the way down to the hardware, and in that case, it's kind of spooky because as an IT guy, there's nothing someone like me can do on anything.
Well, I remember the first time, probably about 8 years ago, that I became aware that little boot up screen that you're seeing in your PC is when the microcode for the chip is loaded from BIOS.
Yep.
It's like, oh, wait, that sounds like attack surface to me.
Yep.
Well, you know, and that's when I suffered a Stack Overflow and just went on to other things. It's like, I don't want to think about that.
One guy's feature is another guy's attack vector. You know, it's not a flaw; it's a feature. And you know, there's always going to be this trade-off between convenience and security. And you know, the more you hobble your system, the more secure it is. And that's just, you know, it's the nature of the beast. Good point, though.